Um, the goal of my talk is really that we all walk chemically altered out of this room by changing the concept of decarbonization. Because when the climate problem, we immediately think the problem will be solved by decarbonization and that's it. What we have seen already in the previous presentation, it's a lot about carbon management of the biosphere. And I will illustrate this further on. So decarbonization or defossilization is not enough. We will have to do much more. So why is this carbon management so important for climate change? When you just look at the very basic carbon budget, you have about 91% emissions from fossil fuels, and there's, the remaining comes from land use change, mainly from deforestation. But then we see that the ecosystems actually do already a great service to suck out quite a lot of the fossil fuels which we emitted, by 29% by terrestrial ecosystems, and 26% are absorbed by oceans. And we already had the mentioning of ocean acidification and the impacts on fisheries in the Arctic. And the rest, of course, remains in the atmosphere. So already the ecosystem machinery, the carbon machinery of the biosphere actually does already a big service, but we can actually also increase that, and we heard that before. What we did already 15 years ago, we had a big controversy at IIASA, and we invited people who were actually against the idea of negative emission technologies. So basically technologies that take CO2 out of the atmosphere and put them back into the lithosphere. And you see this here. This is bioenergy combined with carbon capture and sequestration. And what you see here is the emission profile of back then a 2-degree scenario. And what you see is by about 2060 or so, the global energy system goes carbon negative, mainly in order to make up for the carbon sins which we committed before. And it took us about 10 years to actually get the integrated assessment community who do these scenarios to actually take up this idea. And now we're actually able to do the 2-degree scenarios. And we are currently constructing 1 degree or even below scenarios with a little more crazy technologies, and after maybe I get a nice question and then I can elaborate a little bit on these newer technologies. So how are we going to do this? How will this actually look like? This is a degraded ecosystem in Brazil, and this is how it could actually look like in terms of terrestrial carbon management. So you would actually see reforestation with native species triggered by a carbon value here. You would actually see some avoided deforestation for a carbon value. You would see some reforestation for timber value. And you would also see some reforestation for bioenergy, maybe also combined with carbon capture and sequestration or taking other pathways for the carbon remaining. And then in the background, we actually need to make up for the agricultural production lost in this area by agricultural intensification elsewhere. And this is something very important, and a very important characteristic of competition for land, that you actually, like in the energy sector, you actually have coal reserves to dig in, and so you actually don't see this competition between different technologies. Here, with land, you have a fixed resource, and there, whatever you do here, it has consequences elsewhere through teleconnections. We will come back to that then a little later. So this was the global picture, the long-term picture, and what happened now in Paris at the climate negotiations, it's the INDCs, the intended nationally determined contributions in terms of greenhouse gas mitigation. And what we did is we actually looked at the land use sector, the LULUCF sector, so land use and land use change and forestry sector. And we were quite surprised that actually when you aggregate up what countries themselves wanted to do in terms of mitigation, we found that about 20 to 25% of the emission reduction should actually come, according to their plans, from managing ecosystems. And so this was quite some surprise to us. And of course, when you then go into the detail, and here you have the baseline trajectorium, and this is the INDC emission profile. When you go in, you actually find very interesting proposals by countries. And the question is really, is this really realistic? And I will give you now a collaboration between IIASA and a group in Brazil, mainly coming out of the National Institute for Space Research, showing how we actually transferred IIASA tools to help the Brazilians to formulate their own INDC, which the minister then also presented in Paris. So we basically start with the model and model validation. It took us about 3 years to get the model to confess, so to say, to really get it. And we had a team of about 10 full-time researchers just in Brazil. And we had an almost equal amount sitting at IIASA. And what we did in terms of validation was geographic validation. So here, what you see is, you see actually the satellite observations, or in terms of deforestation, and this is the prediction by the model, without any, fixed calibration to force the model. It was basically all driven by economics, if you want. But then we also needed to see whether we match economic accounts. And here, this is heads of bovines. So we actually had to calibrate or fix the model, inform the model, such that it actually met different criteria or realities that really materialized. And only this made it possible to get enough credibility from the policy process. And Brazil is probably the toughest ground in terms of competition between land use models. There are about 10 different land use models competing, and everyone wants to get into the policy traction, and many of them do. So once we calibrated and validated the model, we actually looked at very specific scenarios. And here it's basically modeling the forest code of Brazil. So there is one provision is a legal reserve. So you need to have in these red areas here, you need to have, if you have a agricultural land holding, you need to have at least 80% forest on your land. This is the legal reserve. There is a small farm amnesty that the small farms don't have to comply to this rule. Then there's the environmental reserve quota, which is a basic trading mechanism in order to ensure that farms which have already less than 80% forest on their land holding, that they can still comply and buy the credit from somewhere else. And then there is a policy which is the legal enforcement of the deforestation ban. So when we just look now at the results of the Amazon biome, what is very interesting is that there is already this is the no additional policy line, is the black line here. And what you see is that the forest code, which is this line here, without legal law enforcement, would actually be worse than the baseline. So that's how important law enforcement is. One thing which is very interesting is that here you have a line where you have the forest code and the smallholders are actually forced to oblige to the forest code. And here, in this line, you have the forest code, the smallholders need to comply, the legal ban is enforced, and there is no trading. So very simple, in a way, details of a policy make a huge difference in terms of how much forest is really lost or not. One interesting thing which we found is, and this brings me back to this leakage issue. So here you have basically the different policies in terms of forest and forest change in the Amazon. But what you see is in the Caatinga, which is another biome of more dry forest, you actually see the best performing scenario for the Amazon forest is the worst performing in the Caatinga. So basically the agricultural frontier shifts from the Amazon to another biome. And these leakages one has to deal with. And in this project, we also looked quite a lot into biodiversity issues. And this is a real biodiversity hotspot there. And their decisions need to be made. Here, I just want to convey that here you have the different policies. This is the forest code without small hold of amnesty, and here is the forest code without the trading of the land titles. And these small little details in a law would actually be visible from space in 30, 50 years from now. So this is really interesting how detailed one has to model and also inform then a policy process what the details really matter. Another issue is who will win and who will lose from this. So this is soy production in the Amazon biome. And of course, if you just have the forest code as such implemented, this is the best for the soya farmers. But if, for example, you don't have the allowance to trade the titles, then all in a sudden the soy farmers in the Amazon region would really suffer a lot. And if you know Mato Grosso, there's a very powerful governor. He's also one of the biggest soy producers in the world. This is a real political battle that needs to be fought out. So here, there is this asymmetric winner-loser profile, and it's a real political economy issue. But it's very good and interesting that we have this scientific capability to show that these are the trade-offs which are on the table and what the numbers are. Finally, we looked at the greenhouse gas budget overall in CO2 equivalent. And one observation, I will only point to two results. One observation is, contrary to the fossil sector, the land use sector actually has peaked most likely already. So we will see in the future much less emissions from the land use sector. So here you have 2010, and there's basically no other bar, and this is the summary here, the triangle. In all scenarios, it will decline. Just one additional note. In 2050, if you are just in the enforcement of the kind of lax interpretation of the forest code and the most stringent interpretation of the forest code, this difference is about 20 to 25% of current US emissions. So small little details again are really making quite some difference. Okay, so the summary, again, the mantra, decarbonization is not enough. We really need to do ecosystem management for a proper carbon cycle. Land use emissions most likely peaked. It's actually a leading sector and not a lagging sector. This is also something many people did not realize yet. And at IIASA, what we are currently doing, we are engaging not only with Brazil, we engage with the Congo countries, but also with Indonesia. But we do the same thing for the European member states, and in collaboration with some institutions in the US. We also work on very similar projects. And in order to support the INDC process, which is now just continuing. And one idea would be to also hook up more of the SDG agenda onto this INDC process, because that's an ongoing, quite vibrant policy process. Thank you very much.
Wow.